Hello, everybody. Welcome. I know some people are going to be still trickling in as they come from classes. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the second of a series of lectures that the Moynihan Center is organizing in partnership with the Jack Miller Center to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the United States Declaration of Independence. And today we have the great privilege of having a university president with us and a traveling companion, as I will say in a second, Professor Greg Weiner, who I will now introduce in a second. As usual, the format for these conversations will be an initial lecture of around 40 minutes that will be delivered by Professor Weiner, and then there will be time for questions by you. So I encourage all of you to prepare those questions, and I will be moderating that conversation. There will be ample time for that, so please, all of you, think about a question because everybody's going to get a chance. I know that Professor Weiner has prepared his comments, so we know exactly how long they're going to last. There's going to be ample time. We're not going to go over time. So without further ado, I'll introduce the guest, and then we'll take it from there. Greg Weiner is currently the president of Assumption University in Worcester, Massachusetts, where he's also been a professor of political science since 2011, and where he previously also directed another Moynihan Center, whose missions and activities are similar to this one's, and which we therefore see as a valuable traveling companion. Greg is the author of several important academic monographs, including Madison's Metronome, The Constitution, Majority Rule, and the Tempo of American Politics, and American Burke, The Uncommon Liberalism of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, both published by Kansas University Press. His book about, Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan being the namesake of the center too, and the inspiration for his lecture today, connecting the values of the Declaration with some of the thoughts of Senator Moynihan. Today he will be delivering the second of our series of lectures to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the United States Declaration of Independence, co-sponsored by the Jack Miller Center. His lecture is entitled On the Use and Abuse of Expertise in Politics, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the Founders and the Possibilities and Limits of Social Science. Please join me in welcoming Professor Weiner. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Carlo was telling me that some people may be wandering in, and I'm reminded that I used to work in politics of a politician I used to work for would say that you don't worry when people walk out on you, it's when they start walking toward you that you should be concerned. I was also telling him I have not been to City College before, but it lives large in family lore because my grandfather of blessed memory was a student here in would have been give or take 1930. He would have graduated, and it certainly served the purpose for him that it continues to serve for so many people today. So I'm grateful to the Moynihan Center, of course, to the Jack Miller Center for the invitation. Daniel Patrick Moynihan possessed a perceptive mind and a peerless pen. So it's no small claim to rank an aphorism as his pithiest and most cited. But the theme of the Moynihan Center's celebration of America's 250th birthday, "You're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts," has accurately captured the maxim with which he remains most associated. The Center's decision to place Moynihan's view of facts in relief against the Declaration of Independence's invocation of self-evident truths invites us to consider both concepts more deeply and to avoid the temptation to reduce them to witticisms alone. Moynihan is broadly known as a social scientist among politicians, while the Declaration's primary author, Thomas Jefferson, is often seen as a poet among politicians. This risks a reductionist view of each. It's tempting to understand Moynihan as believing that public policies should be based on social science. How could we think otherwise? A social scientist of greater stature and talent has seldom served in high office. Similarly, we often see the founding generation as philosopher-statesmen who treated politics as a science in the modern Baconian sense of the term. But I shall argue in these remarks that Moynihan is far better understood as a theorist of the limits of social science in politics. That is because he understood social science, but even more so because he understood politics. And if we grapple with how Moynihan understood both, we can also come to grips more readily with what the Declaration of Independence actually says and how the founding generation actually saw the science of politics. My goal is to establish the following. First, Moynihan did not believe social science was a helpful aid in constructing public policy. Policymaking was a political, not a scientific endeavor. Second, Moynihan believed there were actually dangers in using social science prospectively. At best, it was unhelpful, and at worst, it risked encouraging utopian schemes, corrosive overpromising, and what I shall call, in my words, not Moynihan's, a tyranny of expertise. That does not mean Moynihan rejected expertise in any nihilistic sense, quite the opposite. But scientific expertise and political judgment were different things. Finally, I shall turn briefly to the Declaration's understanding of self-evident truths for the purpose of showing the compatibility between Moynihan's understanding of social science and the founder's understanding of what Alexander Hamilton called improvement in the science of politics. First then, Moynihan did not believe social science should be used to construct social policy. You're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts, beats it for pithiness, but Moynihan's view of social science and expertise is far better captured by a lesser-known observation. Contained in his book, Maximum Feasible Misunderstanding, a critique of the war on poverty, not, I hasten to add, of policy to alleviate poverty, this observation is less quotable but more instructive, and it is this. The role of social science lies not in the formation of social policy, but in the measurement of its results. Now, to understand the importance of that statement, we need to situate it in the context of what Moynihan believed were the shortcomings of the Great Society. To his death in 2003, Moynihan remained an ardent New Deal liberal. Moynihan saw in the New Deal a heroic and successful effort to alleviate poverty, largely through the mechanism of social insurance. The failure of the Great Society, he believed, lay in its attempt to re-engineer society to eliminate the causes of poverty. This distinction between New Deal liberalism and Great Society liberalism is vital for understanding Moynihan's thought. New Deal liberalism uses the power of government to collect and redistribute money in order to alleviate poverty. Great Society liberalism, he observed, exaggerated the ability of experts to engineer social arrangements. Moynihan put it this way, quote, "The American national government is a superb instrument for redistributing power and wealth in our society. But as an instrument for providing services, it is a highly unreliable device." The Great Society's attempt to root out not only poverty, but also its causes, fulfilled the intrinsic logic of what I shall call capital P progressivism. In contemporary rhetoric, progressivism denotes a range of left-of-center political views. In the late 19th and early 20th century contexts, it meant something more specific. It claimed, in essence, that politics corrupted the pure rationality of policy in the same way that, for example, a committee editing a sentence will diminish the eloquence of a rhetorician writing it alone. According to capital P progressivism, policies that sought to balance the range of views and values intrinsic to political life should instead be engineered by experts. The messiness of compromise and accommodation, of best guesses and prudent judgment, should be replaced with the clean through lines of academic analysis. This was the view of early progressives like John Stuart Mill, Lester Frank Ward, and Woodrow Wilson. Ward pioneered the idea of scientific, as he called it, scientific legislation. If only politics could be investigated and resolved by the same principles as, say, physics or chemistry, Ward believed, progress could be guaranteed. Now, anyone who has actually worked in or been around politics can see the problems emerge even with that simplistic framing. For starters, it assumes that everyone in a pluralistic society agrees as to what constitutes progress. It also excludes the question of what should be conserved. As Max Weber observed, it is the fate and indeed the hope of science to become obsolete. When this ethos is applied to society, change becomes a permanent good, and the accumulated wisdom of the past becomes intrinsically suspect. What has not yet happened is always potentially better than what has already occurred. Moreover, progress on this understanding assumes an ideological cast. To oppose progress is to be irrational. So taking dissenting views seriously is not only unnecessary, it is illogical. Moynihan's rejection of scientific solutions to social problems arose from his understanding of society, that is, human beings living together, pursuing both disparate and shared aims, adjusting these to one another, as infinitely complex. Because of that complexity, social engineering, he thought, is not only inadvisable, it is impossible. A butterfly flapping its wings on the west coast of Africa might very well, as the saying goes, trigger a chain of events that results in a hurricane in the Atlantic. But no one attempts, for that reason, to regulate the behavior of butterflies. The metaphor is useful for tracing events back to causes, but not for manipulating the future. We understand, of course, that the causes of weather events are infinite. Social problems do have causes, but if what Walt Whitman said of individuals is true, we are large, we contain multitudes, then hundreds of millions of individuals sharing a society constitute a system every bit as complex, diffuse, and impossible to engineer as the weather. Events that have already occurred can be concretely assessed rather than abstractly predicted. Future events resist precise analysis because, at the risk of stating the obvious, they have not yet happened. If the past is a foreign country, the future is an undiscovered one. And the future grows increasingly opaque the more complex systems become. When Moynihan said we are entitled to our own opinions but not our own facts, he did not mean there were endlessly knowable facts and that we could solve all social problems simply by arranging and applying them correctly. He meant that we should use the information we have to try to operate a step ahead of problems, assess what we learn, and adapt accordingly. One reason great society liberalism was failing, Moynihan wrote, was the unwillingness of defenders of programs to acknowledge failure and thus their inability to learn. They may have operated on seemingly noble motives, but that could itself cloud their judgment. Moynihan warned, quote, "In our desire to maintain public confidence in such programs, we have tended to avoid the evidence of poor results. And in particular, we have paid too little heed to the limited capacities of government to bring about social change." Writing of the failures of education reforms in the 1960s, Moynihan observed this. "But what to do," he asked, "if it turns out that those measures in which we have had so much confidence may have let us down? It seems to me that once this question is asked, it answers itself readily enough. If old techniques don't work, devise new ones. Of all institutions, American education ought to be open to experimentation and innovation and to the evaluation of results." Close quote. Yet a danger lurks if we overstate Moynihan's understanding of the limits of social science in politics. We might, after all, say that because society is infinitely complex and cannot be engineered according to what one interest or another deems to be rational, we should simply throw up our hands in defeat. That was decidedly not Moynihan's view. In warning against social engineering, Moynihan wrote, quote, "I surely do not argue for a quietistic government acquiescing in whatever the tide of fortune or increments of miscalculation bring about. And in our time, they have brought about hideous things," close quote. So Moynihan believed in the profound power of social science to illuminate social phenomena and in the equally profound power of government to do good. He warned, in fact, against exploiting the shortcomings of the Great Society to discredit government in general, a tendency he especially deplored when Democrats succumbed to it. In his 1977 State of the Union address, for example, President Carter sought to temper expectations of government, seemingly a goal Moynihan would support and to an extent did. Carter declared the following: "Government cannot solve all our problems, set all our goals, or define our vision. Government cannot eliminate poverty, provide a bountiful economy, reduce inflation, save our cities, cure illiteracy, provide energy, or mandate goodness." This statement, Moynihan regretted, repudiated Great Society engineering at the expense of New Deal liberalism. Carter, he reflected, had retreated too far. Now quoting Moynihan, "The government can eliminate poverty. That is, poverty defined as income below a certain level. A good welfare reform bill would do that. This is precisely the kind of thing government can succeed in doing. It cannot mandate goodness, but it can save our cities. If not from sin, then surely from bankruptcy." As opposed to social engineering, Moynihan saw the art of politics, of what Aristotle and Burke called prudence, as the ability to see just a little ahead and to take a step at a time, evaluate and correct or proceed accordingly. That is, he wrote, quote, "no great feat. In a chess master, it involves considerable intellectual elegance, but politics is mostly checkers. It is no great thing to estimate the various possibilities for the next move, but one." That is why the title of Coping, a collection of Moynihan's reflections on the politics of the 1960s, is so elegantly suggestive. The leader's art, and art significantly, not science was the word he used, quote, "is not that of prophesying, but of coping." Coping, moreover, was, quote, "no timorous exercise, much less a surrender to expediency." Where then does that leave social science? Social science could help us understand social phenomena and the effect of social policy. That understanding might shape future policy, but it could not determine it, if only because public policy is never about a single goal, one interest, or undisputed values. What social science could do with considerable sophistication was to help us understand the results of political decisions on complex systems. That, in turn, could influence future choices. Here is an instance that testifies to Moynihan's greatness as a statesman and as a scholar. As domestic policy advisor to President Nixon, Moynihan had led an unsuccessful fight for a guaranteed national income. He thought it might have several salutary effects, including alleviating poverty, but also encouraging both family cohesion and stabilizing work. In 1977, Moynihan, then a freshman Democratic senator, was sitting at the dais in a committee hearing when, like a dramatic courtroom scene in an episode of Perry Mason, someone rushed in with the late-breaking results of a study of a guaranteed income experiment in Seattle. That study seemed to show that a guaranteed income failed to achieve the desired results and may, in fact, have contributed to their opposite. At the hearing, Moynihan exclaimed, quote, "we were wrong about the guaranteed income. Seemingly, it is calamitous. It increases family dissolution by 70%, decreases work, etc. Such is now the state of science, and it seems to me we are honor-bound to abide by it at the moment. I turn now to Moynihan's concern that prospective social science could be dangerous. That is especially true because it risks a politics of over-promising, a politics of the ultimate, and again, my words, not Moynihan's, a tyranny of expertise. The proper result of understanding the role of the politician versus that of the social scientist was, Moynihan wrote, quote, not so much great caution as great care. He meant care about unintended consequences, but also about what he felt the 1960s most demonstrated, the particular danger of government over-promising. The claim that political problems had precise scientific answers was itself an excessive promise, and it led to even more of them. In the introduction to Coping, Moynihan identified the central lesson of the 1960s. Quote, if I am wrong in this, I am right in little else. The polity must take care what it undertakes to provide, for failure to do so is likely to be attributed to malevolent purpose. This is not to say expectations should not be raised, but only that they should not be raised indiscriminately. The natural reaction to overpromising was disillusionment and the most corrosive force in politics then as now, cheap cynicism. For the same reasons it leads to overpromising, confusing social science with political judgment also leads to a politics of the ultimate, in which the accommodations that are natural to political life become immoral or irrational. Recall in this context that capital P progressivism saw legislation as a scientific enterprise over which experts should preside. If there are objectively correct answers to every political problem, there is no natural limit or governor on what politics should attempt to achieve. Like many ideologies, this form of progressivism is difficult to distinguish from religious fundamentalism. Each marches steadily toward ultimate overpowering goals, and in both cases, compromise on those goals is irrational, immoral, or both. Moynihan understood the difference and its consequences. Quote, it is the seeming nature of the chiliast to resist social changes which, however profound, are not perceived as somehow ultimate. Now, it is natural to politics that if you want 2 and I want 4, we compromise on 3. By contrast, if you and I are trying to solve the mathematical problem of 2 plus 2, the answer is 4 whether we agree or not. In that case, compromising on 3.5 is not simply unwarranted, it is irrational. In order to apply that kind of rational analysis to politics, one of the imperatives of the early progressive movement was to enlighten the people. Lester Frank Ward framed the central problem of scientific legislation as legislators, quote, placing their constituents upon the highway to a condition of intelligence, close quote, a condition he was unembarrassed to say the people had not yet attained. Lest there be any question, I am all for intelligence in the diffusion of knowledge, but encouraging the diffusion of knowledge is one thing. Using the power of the state to render the supposedly ignorant masses intelligent, as those in authority at any given moment understand that term, is condescending at best. At worst, it is dangerous. And here we arrive at the particular risk of isolating expertise from politics and thus empowering experts without limitation. Political problems, as I have suggested, tend not to be scientific problems. But allow me to say what a college president never should. Academics are encumbered by our mortal condition. That is to say, experts are subject to the same temptations to abuse that afflict any other human being with unchecked power. Put otherwise, before heeding Plato's call to empower philosopher kings, we should at least take note of the class interests of philosophers. One of Moynihan's insights into the politics of the 1960s was that experts, like everyone else, were prone to the temptations of power. And there are two especially dangerous accelerants to the abuse of power. One is when the person exercising power cannot be questioned, and the other is when the person exercising power is intoxicated with the belief that he or she is doing good. Moynihan observed this of the 1960s era welfare caseworker who tried to eliminate the causes of poverty by telling people how to live. The government's role in alleviating poverty had shifted from giving money to people who lacked it to empowering an administrative class to minister to the perceived needs of people living in poverty. The ironic result was an upward redistribution of income. Moynihan observed it involved taxing the working poor to pay college-educated middle-class administrators to watch over them. Moynihan's view of this was at best ambiguous. He noted that a survey of social workers had shown that 71% chose their profession for reasons they classified as humanitarian. Moynihan continued, quote, "Now one would wish this. It is surely a good thing for caseworkers to see themselves in this light, or almost surely. But it tends," he continued, "to confuse public debate. Shoe factory workers in Manchester, almost certainly earning considerably less than social workers in the same city, are not permitted to declare that they have chosen their profession for humanitarian reasons." Close quote. Moynihan never subscribed to the caricature of the social worker who desired or somehow induced poverty to preserve the need for his or her services. But he also noted it was an unavoidable fact that these administrative professionals had an interest in poverty continuing and in political solutions to it running through their expertise rather than through simpler means like cash transfers. Needless to say, going into social work in the 1960s or now would be a lousy strategy for getting rich. The seduction, however, and it is a subtle one, might be that of power. Thus, the risk of a tyranny of expertise. More often, the problem is a confusion and vast oversimplification of the expert's role. But we should not expect experts in any field to be immune to the temptations of power, especially when it is, by its nature, unchecked. In contemporary politics, we have a vaunted opinion of experts that would be an unreasonable standard to which to hold them if they did not cherish and defend their role and its attendant authority so fiercely. It has become commonplace for journalists writing about this or that issue to preface a statement with "scientists say" or "experts say." Professors of logic recognize this as a fallacy, the appeal to authority. It is much less click-worthy to refer to the best information we have amid a world of infinite trade-offs and inherent uncertainties. But that is the world Moynihan saw the politician both does and should occupy. The scientist may see through a microscope clearly, but the politician sees through a glass darkly. The scientist, moreover, can tell us what the evidence says about a single phenomenon, but not about the trade-offs with respect to other issues that are inevitably involved in how it is addressed. In this sense, the appeal to experts tends to skirt complexities. For example, experts in what? On the issue in question, is there more than one form of expertise involved? Do the experts all agree with each other? Study hint on the last question, ask your faculty about their last department meetings. Supposedly settled science, invoked as indisputable authority, is in fact antithetical to the scientific enterprise itself. Two examples I hope will suffice to make the point. The scientific consensus on gravity was settled from Newton's laws in 1687 until Einstein upended them in 1915. For decades, physicians widely understood that stomach ulcers were caused by stress and diet. Then in 1984, a landmark study concluded that they were caused by a bacterium instead. By the mid-1990s, ulcers were being successfully treated with antibiotics. Had we simply shut down the science in either case at the point at which it seemed settled, we would have prevented new discoveries. One of Moynihan's favorite aphorisms was from the Catholic essayist Georges Bernanos. Quote, "The worst, the most corrupting lies are problems poorly stated." The slogans we use today, follow the science, or science is real, or believe in science, are poorly stated problems because they say something different from what we actually mean. What we mean when we say politicians should follow the science is that their decisions should be guided by the best information available to them in all its complexity and uncertainty. The fact that a scientific consensus is widespread and sustained is pertinent to public policy. But scientific discovery is often powered by the lonely heretic who questions conventional wisdom and shifts the paradigm of scientific conversation. When Moynihan wrote that politics is more checkers than chess, he meant that, at the risk of torturing the analogy, doctors treat ulcers when a patient shows up with them. A physician who advised a patient with an ulcer or any other condition to stand by and await the results of decades of longitudinal studies would not stay in practice for long. Physicians operate as we should want them to, on the best information they have at the moment they must make decisions. Then they evaluate the results and adjust accordingly. The problem occurs when, as now seems common, expertise is invoked to justify itself and silence rather than encourage dispute. For example, there is now ample evidence in the public record that the scientific consensus that guided the government response to COVID-19 was in fact influenced by coordinated efforts to silence scientific dissent. Whether one agrees with them or not, perfectly reasonable scientists who pointed out that cloth masks were known to be useless for viral particles the size of COVID-19, or that children isolated during school closures were at risk of profound social and educational damage, were denied opportunities for peer-reviewed publication and often publicly denounced as fringe voices indifferent to death. Another thing we tend actually to mean in saying that a question is scientific, not political, is that it is irrational and therefore impermissible to disagree with the view being stated. Now, because my topic is Moynihan, and because Moynihan did liberalism the service of internal criticism, I have inevitably focused on these tendencies of capital P progressivism. But there is ample partisan poison from which to pick. There are two basic pathologies in American politics today. One, on which I've focused in these remarks, is the belief that one's opponents are unenlightened. The other is the belief that one's adversaries are immoral. You can judge which is more condescending and less persuasive to the accused. Both are categorical claims that attempt to place questions of politics beyond reasonable dispute. Both are intended to antagonize rather than persuade, and to silence rather than engage. And especially if political questions are always ultimate questions, if every dispute seems to pose existential risks to the losing side, these terms of debate cannot cope with the complexities of a large republic in which reasonable people disagree with each other. Proceeding now to my final point, What does all this have to do, if anything, with the Declaration of Independence's invocation of self-evident truths? There's a myth of the American founding that is similar to the misunderstanding of Moynihan. It holds that the American regime was constructed from scratch in the political equivalent of a sterilized lab on the basis of Enlightenment philosophy. This myth of the virgin birth of the Constitution ignores the fact that it proposed literally almost no political arrangements that had not already been long used either in England or in the colonies. Similarly, the bulk of political analysis in the Federalist Papers is historical. It is an assessment of failed and successful regimes. If the Declaration is read in full, which it too rarely is, a similar pattern is evident. There is a little bit of philosophy and a little bit of poetry, but the bulk of the actual document consists of concrete grievances about political arrangements that were already in place. We can see in these methods at least metaphorical similarities to Moynihan's view that social science could be used to assess what has already occurred, but not to engineer the future. And against this backdrop, we can consider the Declaration of Independence. While Moynihan commented on various aspects of our constitutional structure, I'm aware of only one occasion on which he expounded on the Declaration in any detail. That was in a 1977 address to the New York Academy of Sciences, which Moynihan entitled "On the Exhaustion of Political Ideas." Moynihan opens that address by rejecting the dominant view at the time that the influence of science on public policy was growing. At the nation's founding, he proposed, it was the dialogue between science, what today we might call pure science, and political thought that was so fruitful. Divorcing the two, Moynihan warns, is a dicey business. Addressing the Declaration, Moynihan cites its self-evident truths as grounded in what we would call science today. That is, the laws of nature and of nature's God. Now, I have some quibbles with that analysis, but I want to follow it to understand what he means. Moynihan, quoting his friend, the political theorist Martin Diamond, calls liberty a modern idea based on the philosophical progress of the Enlightenment. The laws of nature, on Moynihan's reading, root the Republic, quote, in the truths of natural science. Yet the entire idea of attributing these truths to nature or to nature's God was that these laws were fixed. They may have been understood with greater clarity in the 18th century, but they were not cooked up in a laboratory. Indeed, the description self-evident indicates that something other than what we today call science was at work. Euclid uses the term self-evident to describe his axioms of geometry. The concept's transmission to the American founders almost certainly runs through the philosopher John Locke. Well, we think with reasonable justification of the Declaration as the product of Locke's second treatise and its analysis of rights emerging from the state of nature, his essay concerning human understanding was far more broadly read and much more influential. And Locke's essay defines the term self-evident with some care. Self-evident principles present themselves immediately to the understanding in all but tautological terms. For instance, Locke's example of a self-evident axiom is, quote, a man is a man. Locke proceeds to explain that when we begin relating principles to each other, the resulting complexity leaves little to no room for additional axioms that are self-evident. So the self-evident truths of the Declaration, personal equality and the equal standing of peoples to govern themselves, cannot be the products of what we would call progressive Weberian science today, in which we discover one thing and on the basis of that discover another, and so forth. In such a science, self-evidence would lose its meaning. Nor could self-evident truths be the basis for any prospective design of a regime. And in fact, the Declaration is strikingly silent on governing forms. It says the American people cannot subject themselves to the supervision of the British people, but tells us almost nothing about how the American people should govern ourselves. Still, Moynihan believed that basing the fundamental principle of equality on philosophical or scientific analysis was fruitful. But it could not be considered simply in the abstract, isolated from politics. Where science was derailed, Moynihan proposed, was when it moved from this dialogue between axiomatic truths and political thought toward applied science instead. As we recall, this is exactly the direction toward which the capital P progressives moved when they called for the scientific resolution of political questions. This kind of applied science, Moynihan showed, was abused to advance all manner of grotesque political claims, and he cites two. Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, claimed that science had advanced beyond Jefferson's day and now proved the supposed positive good of enslavement. Karl Marx's science of history unleashed horrific abuses in the 20th century. Speaking in 1977, Moynihan said liberal democracy had no more serious intellectual competitors. The problem was that it was therefore unmoored from political conversation. The risk was the delusion that liberal democracy could instead simply turn to problems of technical implementation resolved through expertise. Consequently, Moynihan said, quote, liberal democracy seems either to face an absence of political thought or to risk seeing that vacuum filled with a technocratic perspective on society that seeks to solve problems by treating individuals as mere subjects of science, by progressing, as it were, beyond freedom and dignity. That last reference to beyond freedom and dignity is to a 1971 book in which the behavioral scientist B.F. Skinner denied the existence of free will, insisting instead that human behavior is fully determined by environmental factors. And because it is determined by environmental factors, Skinner thought we could solve social problems with what he called, quote, a technology of behavior. That is a haunting note on which to conclude these remarks. Skinner's scientific utopia, or so he thought of what most of us would call a dystopia, should linger in our minds. So should the fate of human dignity in that context. There would be none. Indeed, there would be no grounds even for asserting that any human behavior is dignified or undignified as opposed to well or poorly engineered. In such a worldview, there is no freedom, nor is there any reason for it. This is the culmination of Thomas Hobbes's claim at the dawn of Baconian science that human beings are simply bodies in motion, and that political questions could therefore be resolved with the same apparent certainty and detachment as questions of physics or arithmetic. This world is a world without democracy, without dignity, without politics. It is a world as alien to the Declaration as it is to Moynihan. And the equality and dignity it would sacrifice are in equal measure self-evident truths and facts to which we are all entitled. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was amazing in many ways. I'm going to stand up so that I can make sure that I can see you all, and I'm just opening it up for the floor for your questions, and I will begin with Ishika.
Good afternoon, thank you again for your time.
Wait a second. Actually, are we going to, since we're recording this, it's here. We're going to, please wait for the microphone. And stand up. Sorry. These are instructions I am receiving from the back.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your time. My question really relates to the entire premise of the title of the lecture, more specifically the quote that you referred to from Moynihan, the issue that he highlights as the tyranny of expertise. I ask because I feel a sense of disconnect with the issue that Moynihan focuses on, especially when I reflect on the contemporary state of politics right now, especially at the federal level, where I feel that the issue stems more from a lack of expertise rather than an excess of expertise. I see departments being shut down, people with subpar credentials being propped up as leaders instead, and ideology taking greater precedence over facts, or what Moynihan criticizes as science. So my question is that if Moynihan criticized expertise or a blind deference to expertise, then how would he interpret, criticize, or analyze the current political context where seemingly this issue stems from a lack of expertise?
Great question. The tyranny of incompetence.
Do you want me to stand up? Or?
Please, if you prefer to stand.
If I can operate the microphone, that would be the question. Thank you. It's a very important question. So let me say, first of all, that one thing I believe college presidents should not do is weigh in on contemporary politics. The reason for that is not some abstract view of institutional neutrality, is that there is, dare I say it, no particular reason anyone should care about what we think about politics. The second thing I try not to do is project Moynihan into contemporary disputes, but the basis of the question is a very important one. So there is no question that there is a denigration of expertise happening, and that we are perhaps seeing some ill consequences of that. What I would state, I guess by way of challenge, is if in fact expertise has been abused in the past to shut down dissent, it would not excuse the fact, but it would help explain the fact that there is such resistance to it and so little deference to it today. But a very valid point, either way. Let me just make clear, the tyranny of expertise was, those were my words, so don't blame Moynihan for those.
All right. Please raise your hands if you have a question. Don't be shy or afraid. Yes?
Hi, my name is Mohammed. So I think you were talking about these evident truths and like these objective senses of reality that people should come to. But how do we argue or discuss these, especially with people who seemingly don't agree with these objective senses of reality? Like you mentioned, 2 + 2 = 4. But what if someone were to say to 5 or 3 just because they think they know some alternative reality? How do we discuss it with them, especially when they disagree with you on the basis of your identity?
Alternative truths, you might say. Here's what I would say. I think this is really important because we have a tendency, I would say, of the last, let's call it decade, 15 years in politics has been to delegitimize areas of argument that should be legitimate. So remember what Locke said was a self-evident truth. A man is a man. That is a pretty low bar. So there are not, in Locke's view, and I would say the Declaration, and Euclid, if some of you are geometry experts, I'm not going to try to get out over my skis on that. We're not talking about a lot that they're actually saying is indisputable. So and remember that what Locke says is when you start to link these self-evident axioms together, you begin to get complex systems that lose their self-evidence. That doesn't mean they're wrong. It just means that they're not self-evident in the sense of immediately presenting themselves to the imagination. So by way of example, if memory serves, Jefferson's original draft used the words obvious and undeniable, I think. Somebody can help me on that. So I think it is helpful as citizens to think of those as at a pretty basic level. And one thing I often say, you can, if you're acutely bored, you can look up my bio and see who I worked for in politics, and it was not anyone currently in authority. I do think one result, and as I said, there are these two pathologies that I think are equally problematic in American politics, is that one can't be, this is not directed at your question, it's directed at the more general point. I don't think you can be a good citizen while holding half of your fellow citizens in abject contempt. And that seems to be where we've ended up. So what I would encourage us is, if we're arguing with somebody who says 2 + 2 is 5, okay, that's not an argument. There's not much there. I do think so my field is political theory, which for some reason we refuse to call political philosophy. I can't explain that to you. But there's a method of reading that is referred to generally as a charitable reading of text, which is to say, listen for what the author is trying to say, rather than getting wrapped up in this, that, or the other detail or punctuation mark of what's actually being said. So I think an important attribute of citizenship today is, I would say, is the same thing. I say this to students at Assumption all the time, that there are 3 virtues associated with learning, and I think they're associated with citizenship too. One is humility, right? I might be wrong. You might know something that I don't. In fact, chances are you probably know a lot that I don't. The second is courage, which is I'm going to speak my mind when I hear something that I disagree with. And the third is charity, which is to say when somebody disagrees with me, I'm going to assume, this assumption is not always correct, but it's not a bad starting assumption, that they're not trying to offend me or delegitimize me or silence dissent. I should listen to what they're actually trying to say. I think that's a good rule of citizenship.
All right, I know that Pragya has one, but I wanted to start. I'm also a political theorist, so I was fascinated. I think in many ways I agree with what you're saying.
Can we be done there?
No. Oh. So I am also concerned about the risks of the tyranny of expertise, of people disqualifying opposition because they believe they have the truth. And I'm very much, and I believe this is the foundation of liberalism, what you call humility, for sure. But going back to that quote of Senator Moynihan that you started from, are there any facts in politics?
Sure.
And what role should they play? Are there things that cannot be disputed? And with this very minimal reading of what the self-evident truths are, according to Locke, you have reduced it to a very low bar, as you said. A man is a man. That's the only thing we cannot disagree with. But what about, I don't know, Germany invaded Belgium in 1914, or things like that? Do these things matter to politics?
Sure.
And is there room for disagreements about those or not? And Arendt famously talked a lot about the risk of undermining facts. And how that can undermine a common shared space of political disagreement.
Sure. So I think for Moynihan, the question was, what's the proper use of facts? It was certainly not denying that they exist. Remember the passage that I quoted that he said he was not arguing for a quietistic government that simply acquiesced in whatever it might be. So I'm going to try to quote Edmund Burke, and that means I'm going to botch quoting Edmund Burke. But who was, by the way, in modern times is thought of as the father of modern conservatism. In his day was thought of as a reformer. He was a champion of the early progressives, so he's sort of available for interpretation according to how you want to read it. But one point he made was, bear with me, it is against all rules of jurisprudence to draw a general principle from an extreme case. So in other words, there are instances of necessity. There are certainly instances where Germany invades Belgium, whatever the case may be, that I would say are cases that are, let's call them beyond the pale of reasonable dispute, and that, by the way, within actual functioning politics, as opposed to in a philosophical setting, it probably is not used. It's probably counterproductive to dispute. I do think there is, however, I'm going to say, just for the sake of being provocative, there is an equal danger in saying, here is the totality of my political beliefs, they belong in that category. And that, I think, is the danger that we need to be aware of.
Great, thank you. Pragya.
Hi, thank you. You mentioned the example of COVID and how sort of contrarian academic thoughts were suppressed during COVID. I think what's interesting about that is that I agree with that, but then also there was a lot of disinformation being spread on social media especially, and I think that there's been a change recently of social science being more accessible to the public, but also not, maybe it's a bit sort of patronizing to say, but the public not fully appreciating it in the context that maybe a professional academic would, right? And so It's being seen as a sort of clickbait, bringing things down, condensing them to be more accessible to the public, but then also having the public make decisions based on that that are maybe harmful or not fully appreciating the context in that. So how has social media affected sort of the publication of social science?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good point, and an effect of social media and the proliferation of information and online sources in general, I would say, has eliminated a lot of what we might call mediating or editorial barriers. I asked students in a class, it's been a while since I taught a class, but as you can probably tell, I was telling students once in a class that it used to be there were 3 networks. And then each one would have the evening news at 5 or 6 o'clock, depending on your time zone. And you would argue about which was biased and which wasn't, but they were all operating within the same general understanding of reality. Now, a student who I did pass had the audacity to raise her hand when I asked if there were questions. She said, the question was, yes, were you alive then? So, yes, I was. I think, let me recommend a book to you, and it's by 2 very distinguished political scientists called In COVID's Wake. These are Princeton political scientists. It's published by the Princeton University Press, and it shows, it does not assert, it's public information requests, that the public health officials guiding the response to COVID, by the way, I was a university administrator during COVID. There were a lot of decisions that had to be made very quickly in sort of fog of war with very limited information, and I give a lot of grace for mistakes, including ones that I was involved in at the time. It does, however, show things very clearly. It's quoting emails from household names, sort of the untouchable scientific parental figures that we've come to associate with the pandemic, saying to each other that Professor so-and-so, an epidemiologist at thus and such a prestigious university, needs to be shut down, that we need to call this scientific publication and say, don't publish that. And the danger here, I think your underlying point is still valid, but the danger here is that they cited was exactly what you're saying, which is that the public won't understand this, and the public will therefore make bad decisions. And what that resulted in was what I think we now know to be, again, with plenty of grace for incomplete information and fog of war and so forth, what we now know, and what I see, and I'm sure you see on a college campus too, we're seeing the after effects of that now, and there were, in fact, real costs to policy choices that we now know were based on shutting down dissent. Now, I think it is an entirely good, valid, and arguable view that in the early days of the pandemic, maybe even all the way through the pandemic, the most important thing was preventing death. Now, that is generally not, in my mind, a good way, right? I mean, as you know from your public policy textbooks, if that were our only goal, the speed limit on the highways would be 5 miles an hour. That's a very different thing from saying, don't disagree because people might misunderstand. And I think a sign of a self-confident scholar is someone who will say to you, tell me what I'm missing, tell me where I'm wrong.
Great. I think we have time for 2 more questions. I'll begin with Ron, and then Ernila, and Alison. Maybe I'll group some later, but let's start with Ron, and then I'll give you an opportunity to answer.
Thank you so much for a really stimulating talk. Two questions. One is, toward the end of your talk, I won't get the exact phrase that you used perfectly, but you used the phrase or I understood you as saying that social science or research or science framed in a much more kind of conditional, humble way, the best information available during a complex and urgent, related to a complex and urgent problem, that framed that way, it can be part of formulating policy and not just evaluating it in the way that Moynihan kind of stated it probably more starkly than maybe he actually thought. The second question is, I'm just curious, once Moynihan became a politician, an elected politician, or served in the UN, did he rely on social science to either A, inform what he thought was the right policy, or use it to bolster a policy preference he had for other reasons?
Unquestionably. So I'm going to try to answer those questions in order, and I'm going to forget one or the other. So please bear with me. So the first question was whether social science could ever be useful, and I think, despite my heroic efforts to hide it, you may have picked up on a contradiction, which is the biggest contradiction in Moynihan's own thinking on this is the guaranteed national income, right? There's a pilot experiment going on in Seattle, and he proposes instituting it nationwide. Now, I think it's important to note he had been through the New Deal. Guaranteed national income was, in his mind, an expansion of Social Security as we understood it. Nevertheless, it is striking. I mean, what impresses me so deeply about accounts of that Senate hearing are, not only does he say from the dais while reading scraps of information, I was wrong. He says, the opposite of everything I thought was right, and I feel honor-bound to abide by it. I would say throughout his career, and Moynihan never really had a career as a pure academic. He was always in and out of politics. I would say unquestionably used social, sometimes in very controversial ways. But it was typically to understand social phenomena. So in other words, I think there can be this misperception of Moynihan is, when I worked in the Senate, he was, Moynihan was a little cantankerous. Lovely man, but known to be a little cantankerous. And the office at the back, there was a hallway where his staff were, and he was at the back, and it was known as Sniper's Alley. So if he had asked for a piece of research and somebody didn't have it, he would get a little perturbed. The myth, I think, is there's Moynihan sitting on a mountaintop located in his office, thinking inside his head in sort of this cartoonish Cartesian fashion, what shall we do? What does the research tell us that we should do? And in much the way Einstein reimagined gravity. I think it was much more using social science to understand social phenomena and the results of policy to the extent one could, and then making best guesses. That's why I think there's such beauty in that formulation that politics is mostly checkers.
All right, we'll group the last two questions, or the last three questions, and then we'll give you an opportunity to respond. Ernila first, then Alison.
Hi, I had a similar question to the social media question. How do you see AI playing into these conversations? We see right now it can sort of hallucinate and make up facts and evident truths that we already know are true because of these expertise and experts. But as tech advances, and you mentioned that the past is foreign, and the future is undiscovered, and it gets more opaque as tech advances. So how do you see the after effects of AI in politics?
Great question. Alison.
Thank you. So I know you said that it's a myth that the founding is sort of like a project of social science, but I think when I read the Declaration or the Federalist Papers and the Constitution, I read it as sort of a political science project where they were trying to develop institutions that sort of can exist outside man and his ills. And so I'm wondering if we take that perspective and sort of entertain the idea that it is a project of social science, then to what extent can we consider the Declaration or the Constitution an example of what we're promising?
We'll take one more question here in the front.
Taking notes.
Hi, my name is Joe. Another favorite quotation of Moynihan's was that organizations in conflict imitate each other. Yeah. And I was just curious in how you would respond in terms of what happens in the light of the current situation in Washington and how the senator would apply that.
Thank you.
Can I take those in reverse order to test my memory? And we'll consider this as a cognitive test for today. So Moynihan called this the iron law of emulation. And the way that what it meant was, remember this is the Cold War, we have this missile system, the Soviets need that missile system, the Soviets have this tank system, therefore we need that tank. Soon enough, everybody is looking like one another, which I'm going to relate back in a minute to the AI question. It's an I mean, I hadn't thought of it in this context, but the absolutism and denunciations do begin to converge, right? So when I said there were two pathologies, one is you're stupid and the other is you're immoral, those cross-pollinate quite a bit. And I'm not sure if this is exactly where you were going with it, but it's very interesting. I mean, you could apply this also to, there's think tanks that proliferate that are increasingly partisan and so forth. Okay, I'm going to go out of order because I think that's related to AI because you have inadvertently stumbled into an educational diatribe. And it's this. Colleges in conflict tend to resemble one another. And it works like this. Now, I think a large, storied institution like City College is a bit different. But for an institution like mine, here's how it works. I'm wondering who's watching this at this point, but that's all right. I'll get in trouble. You have an engineering program. I need an engineering program. I have a nursing program. You better go get a nursing program. So all valuable programs. Pretty soon, nobody is doing actual liberal education, right? So that's very important to us at Assumption, and I believe that there's a crucial distinction to be drawn between what I call literal education and liberal education. Liberal education, you form habits of thought and discernment and judgment that arise from the totality of the education, not from somebody saying, now let me stand in front of a classroom and tell you what prudence is, what ethics is, and so you discern all these things from the whole thing. Colleges that are saying AI is coming, we better have a major in AI or a minor in AI or a center or whatever else the case may be. Is there one here? Am I getting in trouble?
No.
Okay.
I make them use it, but not graduate in it.
I think are learning exactly the wrong lesson because precisely for the reason you're discussing, what we need more than ever are habits of discernment and judgment, human discernment and human judgment that arise from the totality of an education. And the way I've often put this is that the art of asking questions to AI, which the technical people call prompt engineering, who was the original prompt engineer? Socrates, right? This is why reading, I shouldn't say this with another political theorist, this is why reading a Platonic dialogue is so annoying. Because Socrates is clearly asking a series of questions that is pre-planned to reach a conclusion that he, by the way, is then not going to state. All right, social science and the founding. I'm going to go with you on the Federalist and the Constitution, less so on the Declaration. The Declaration is really, it's so seldom. By the way, we had an event at Assumption where we did a public reading of the Declaration. It's so different for the ear than for the eye. And I would encourage you to read it out loud, but also just to read it again and identify what's actually in there that tells you what kind of government the United States should have. Because there's nothing in there that would preclude, for example, a constitutional monarchy with George Washington as the king, or for that matter, as was sometimes proposed, King George III being king of the Americans who have our own legislature. I think that it is certainly the case that the founders, what I call the constitutional framers, understood themselves as engaging in social science. And it would be overstating the case, as I probably tend to do, to say, no, they weren't really doing that. They do it a little opportunistically. So if you read the Federalist, you will sometimes hear, you can't really judge this Constitution by what we used to do because this is totally new. And then you'll sometimes read, would you quit? Would you all calm down? There's nothing to see here, right? So I think the social science that's occurring there is not in a vacuum. It is a very Moynihan, if that's a word, it is now, if that's a word, understanding of social science, which is what can we learn from the past that will help us with the future. That's still a little bit of an overstatement. I think you're making a very valid point.
All right, we're out of time. Please join me in thanking Greg Weiner.
Thank you.